Others have been asking about the book that I've been referring to and taking most of my information from by Helmut Kester, Koester, Helmut, Helmut, a German Lutheran pastor who has a fascinating history of his own that's worth looking up, but his scholarship was in early Christianity and particularly in Paul. So he's got, this is a sort of a larger survey than just Paul, called History and Literature of Early Christianity, 2nd edition, Helmut Kester. And there are a couple chapters that deal specifically with Paul, but also other interesting information about the Gospels and the early formation of the New Testament, as well as the extra-canonical, the outside, the regular canon books as well. So if you're looking for more reading, History and Literature of Early Christianity, 2nd edition, Helmut Kester, Volume 2, I should say, Volume 2. So it is both a 2nd edition and the 2nd volume of a 2-volume set. All right. Well, why don't we come on in? As people arrive, if you guys want to usher them forward, we have seats along the aisle here and up front. So please join us. Hey, Jerry.
Does reading that leave you with more questions?
Oh, yes. Always. Always. So, thank you guys. This is week 3 of our 4-week series. We'll wrap up next week as best we can. But we've been studying Paul. We talked in the first week a little bit about his background, some of his conversion from or into a different way of being around the faith of his ancestors. And we talked a lot about his travels and how he was going to be how he was or understood himself to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And we talked about that as being really important because that is a new understanding or an expanded understanding of God's covenant with the chosen people. So that in and of itself is a major shift. That was not without its problems, right? It was not without its conflicts, even within the very small group of Christians in Jerusalem, Judea area, and he who was working in Antioch, sort of north of there, and then over into, as he moves around, into Syria, and then over into Turkey and Greece. All right. I've not heard that one before. For those watching at home, we're being invaded by aliens. Yeah. All right. So, that's a little bit of background. Last week we talked about how he moved across Turkey from Galatia to Philippi, Thessalonica, down over into Macedonia, northern Greece, look at your map, and then down onto the peninsula into Corinth, Athens, and some of those places. He eventually leaves and we left off last week with his arrival in Ephesus, right? Ephesus around the year of 52, the fall of 52, that is 52 AD, just about 20 years after Jesus. He arrives in Ephesus. That's from Corinth back to Ephesus. And he encounters some interesting situations there. There is some Christianity, it seems like, but that's where he talks about how they have people who have disciples of John the Baptist, or Apollos, a different disciple who's been spreading a message but didn't know the baptism of the Holy Spirit. So there seemed to be some either confusion or lack of continuity between his story, their story. So they try to set all them straight, but he ends up staying in Ephesus for over 2 years. Remember, this is how we ended last week, okay? 2 years, 3 months or so. And there, he writes most of the letters that we have as authentic Pauline letters. So from Ephesus back to those churches that he had just established and visited in places that he'd visited. Okay, remember that? They're looking backwards. So he moves through those places physically, builds these communities, arrives in Ephesus, and then has to check in with them, and it becomes his sort of locus, his place of operation from there. So the other thing we talked about, the last thing, just to remind, because we were tight on time, is that he is not the only one out there trying to spread interesting or new messages about religion. Okay, there are various people within the Gentile world promoting different understandings who are strong people, powerful people, really great speakers, can seemingly work miracles or almost magic in their powers, so they are really compelling to people. So Paul shows up into that context, as well as other people from the other Jews that, remember, Christianity, not even a real thing yet, just a slight offshoot of traditional Judaism that hasn't even really formed yet. There are other offshoots of mainline or straight Judaism that are happening around this time as well as those who are still advocating for traditional mainline Judaism. Okay, so it's a busy marketplace of religious ideas. Let's say it that way. He's not alone in this. And so within that, he has to both carve out his own sense of authority and at the same time then fend off others from encroaching upon that authority when he has established those communities. And that becomes particularly important with the Galatians. Okay? His first letter from Ephesus, chronologically, excuse me, was most likely the letter to the Galatians. And the main issue there are opponents who are coming perhaps from the Jerusalem area, but coming in and saying, no, you do need to abide by the law. Paul had been talking about the fact that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. They don't need to have ritual washing before they eat meals or to keep kosher. He's saying that Christ has come and that law, if you want to keep it, it's fine, but it's no longer necessary. There are people coming to the Galatians and saying, no, if you really want to be a part of this promised people, a part of this covenant, you need to obey the law. So they're called, in Paul's words, Judaizers, trying to sort of pull them back into a very strict and traditional understanding of living by the law. All right? They wander in, and they try to drag these new Gentile converts back into the ritual observance of the law. As we said the first week, part of the reason that was so difficult is because it required circumcision. And it sounds kind of like a joke, but that's like a major deal breaker for a lot of people. So that would be a major hindrance to the spreading of the faith. Seriously. I mean, it actually becomes a really important point of contention. And they seem to be accusing Paul of violating the agreement from Jerusalem back in 48 and 49. Remember, they have that apostolic council in Antioch. And from Antioch, they go to Jerusalem and they say, okay, how are we going to do this? And they say, Paul, you're good to go to the Gentiles. We're going to stay focused on the Jews. But here there are people saying, no, he's either misunderstanding or misinterpreting it or doing it wrong. So that issue is still unresolved, even though they sort of had an agreement. Does that make sense? So in the letter to the Galatians, they have been infiltrated by these Judaizers. And in the letter, Paul spends a lot of time explaining his credentials as both a Jew and an apostle to the Gentiles. If you can remember back to the first week, that big portion that I read about his call, where he says, Christ made himself known to me. I went into Arabia for a few years, then I went into Syria for 14 years and all that. That all comes out of the letter to the Galatians. So the reason for that is he's trying to establish his bona fides as a Jew and make clear that he was given direct instructions by the apostles in Jerusalem to preach to the Gentiles and that they didn't have to obey the law. So he's angry and he's impassioned, and you could understand that if you worked your bum off trying to establish this community, and now there are these people coming in that are threatening that. So he's writing with some vigor. He writes things like this: I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you. Or this: you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? You were running so well. He said, you were running so well. Who prevented you from obeying the truth? And really, again, what's at issue here is this relationship between the old covenant and the new covenant, which wasn't really an old covenant, it was the covenant, right? And then there was this new spin on the old covenant. The opponents are saying that Christ has renewed the old covenant. They're not denying Jesus, but they're just saying he has not abolished it. He's just renewed and sort of reinvigorated everybody's need to live by this law. And Paul's saying something different. He's saying the old covenant has come to an end. Now we have this new avenue or new opportunity, this new portal to relationship with God that is through faith in Jesus Christ. It's a fine but very important distinction. You guys follow that there? Because that's an important one for the conflict that's going on. So for Paul, to go backwards into living by the law would be to nullify and sort of just make unimportant everything that Jesus said and did. Because you'd be going backwards to the way in which things were before, you'd just be a little more excited about it because Jesus came. All right? And that's where he gets in this letter to this sense of fruits of the Spirit versus works of the flesh. Galatians is also famous for that long list of the fruits of the Spirit. That is that sense of this new covenant inspires in us a desire to live in these certain ways, gentleness, peace, etc., and to put away the works of the flesh. And that to him is the law. The law is focused on the works of the flesh. Okay? Now, the question is, did it work? Was he able to convince through a letter, and maybe other letters, but at least one letter, to these Galatians, which again is a region of churches in central Turkey, not one particular community, was he able to do it? Well, apparently so, because a year or so later, he's able to tell the Corinthians that the collection, his sort of stewardship campaign, has made good progress in the Galatian churches. So they were back on board, it seems, with the message and the mission. How exactly that happened, we don't know. That's in the gaps of history. But we do know that there are churches that are in central Turkey, in that area, that can trace lineage back to those earliest days of Paul and onwards from there. So that's the letter to the Galatians. Okay? Then he's got the next letter chronologically from Ephesus, written from Ephesus, is most likely the first letter to the Corinthians. So remember, Corinth, all the way back down in the tip of Greece. So if you can picture him, he's on the western edge. Look at your map if you have it, or just in your head. The western edge of Turkey, riding into central Turkey for the Galatians. Then he's riding to the tip of the Peloponnesus, to Corinth, and writing to them in a major metropolis. Remember, Corinth was a little bit like the center of the world in that corner of the world. And the problem there is not these Judaizers, but that there are divisions emerging among the faithful. Okay, there are divisions between the communities that he formed. And this is really problematic. It's also clear that this letter we call 1 Corinthians was probably not the first letter to the Corinthians. There were probably others before that, at least one. But his occasion for writing was a report from Chloe's people. Remember Chloe snitching on the people back home from last week? We read an excerpt from that. But Chloe's people have made a report to him and have a letter from them. And it's very clear that there are factions emerging, and these factions are based upon some people who feel that they're sort of extra strong in the spirit or have extra understanding or wisdom. Therefore, they are arguing that they should be free to do anything they want. They say, we understand this, we get this, we are children of the resurrection, we believe in this, therefore we don't have to obey not just the law, but really any law or any sense of human decency there. So they are claiming this extraness among themselves. And they're saying things like, all things are lawful for me. And they're taking that freedom from the law a bit too far, to, importantly, the detriment of the community. And that's where Paul gets really worked up. Okay? They're attaching to particular individuals' messages. This is the passage from 1 Corinthians where he said, some of you are claiming to belong to Paul, others to Apollos, others to Cephas, that's Peter, others to... He's like, there's only one person we belong to, and that's Jesus Christ. He said, none of these divisions among who's better or whose disciple has more power or authority. Now, Paul emphasizes and re-emphasizes this need for relationship that builds up the bonds of community, and I want to give you an example of what he's really fed up with about how they're acting, and it comes from the Eucharist. Remember again, back 2 weeks when I pulled out a section that was basically the words of institution, where Paul says, I handed on to you what was handed on to me, and then recites what we recite every Sunday, meaning that before there were Gospels and stories about the Passion written down and that Last Supper, the Christians were doing this ritual meal together through a form of sort of blessing and ritualistic words that were spoken. But This is also part of that same section. Paul writes to the Corinthians, "Now in the following instructions I do not commend you, because when you come together it is not for the better, but for the worse." See how the community, the coming together, is under threat here. "For to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it. When you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper," he says. "For when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry and another becomes drunk." What? "Do you not have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter I do not commend you. Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be answerable for the body and blood of the Lord. Examine yourselves, and only then eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For all who eat and drink without discerning the body." And what does he mean there? Does he mean the little piece of bread? Or does he mean, from an earlier part of that same letter, we are many members, one body? All who eat without discerning the body eat and drink judgment against themselves. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If you are hungry, eat at home, he says, so that when you come together, it will not be for your condemnation. About the other things, I will give instructions when I come. That's what he writes. Do you see that? How that's like that really interesting moment here, where he's saying it's not really about eating and drinking in that moment. It's about the communal nature of what is taking place, and the meal that you are celebrating in this ritual form is meant to build the body, not destroy it. And what's happening in Corinth is it sounds like the rich people are bringing all sorts of food, and they go, "Oh yeah, we're going to eat a whole feast over here, but we're not going to share any with you." And they're all going in their own direction, even if they've all come together. Does that make sense? So that's just emblematic of the problems that are emerging within the Corinthian church. These divisions rather than this unification. And so, as I've been working as a sort of overarching thesis about Paul really being about the creation and the sustaining of community and communal relationships, this is a really interesting and cool example to say this is one where he's really on them and says, no, if you're hungry and you're going to be sort of gluttonous in your eating, have a snack, right? Eat first, because what we're doing here is not really about eating and drinking food. Does that make sense? Good. Okay. So, again, many members, one body, is also the letter where he talks about the many spiritual gifts that we have. And people have different spiritual gifts, but they're all offered together for the good of the whole, for the betterment of the whole. And he ultimately gets to that wonderful point where he's saying knowledge, so to those people who are claiming they have more wisdom, more knowledge, and therefore more freedom, he says knowledge must always be subordinate to love. Right? That's the beginning of 1 Corinthians 13. Those who have all wisdom and all knowledge and all power, anything you do, you're just a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Remember from a wedding or something you might have recently attended? If you do not have love. Love is patient. It's not going to run ahead and eat without you. Love is kind. It is not boastful or generous or arrogant or rude, right? I mean, it's saying it's about how you treat each other, not about how much you know, how wise you might be, or how powerful you may feel in the Spirit. Okay? So then there's the second letter to the Corinthians. And unfortunately, it's very clear that the relationship has deteriorated even further. The question becomes then how to get them back from afar. He's in Ephesus. They're in Corinth. How is he going to use a letter to come to try to help? And what's also clear from 2 Corinthians is it's an amalgamation of probably 3 different letters. It's not a single letter. If you were to read it all the way through from first verse to last verse, there would be changes in tone and content that would strike you as odd. And they are, because they're different letters. All right? The relationship has gotten much worse. Now it's not just divisions that are coming, but among the faithful, but it does seem that there are foreign missionaries that have infiltrated and messing things up. We talked last week about just how impossible it is that there's a church, but could you imagine Paul for a second there? Like, how stressed must you have been all the time to think? You had no idea, right? You couldn't check in with these people apart from these letters. Like, I would just sit there imagining, like, oh my God, there are foreign people that are getting in there and messing up all the work I did. There's just this, like, anxiety that is just, like, pervasive through this whole endeavor. Because he's basically just trusting the Spirit to hold these people together while he's gone. And to be able to maintain in the face of outside pressures, not to mention the legal pressures they may face where they could get arrested or even thrown out of their synagogue, let alone against the Roman authorities. All right? Now, the foreign missionaries who seem to have infiltrated the churches in Corinth were Jewish Christians, but different from those in Galatia, it seems. They're promoting that same idea that Christ has renewed the religion of Israel. Paul is saying something is new had come. But these ones even come with their own letters of recommendation. They're like bringing their own sort of like, folder that you'd bring to an interview to say, well, let me tell you what others have said about my work, so that you can see and you might want to hire me or listen to me. And this impressed the Corinthians mightily. And they start doubting his message and his credentials. Because where were his letters of recommendation? Where were his deeds of power and impressive sort of presentation? Now, Paul goes on to write, he says, the gospel is revealed through weakness and sacrifice and suffering, not deeds of power. But this was not terribly convincing to a group of people who were saying, but these guys seem way cooler, and it seems way nicer to be on their team than it does on this team of suffering and sacrifice and weakness. So it's somewhat of a catastrophe. The biggest metropolis, and perhaps some of his biggest church that had been formed, is really under threat right now. And it's because he does not measure up to what he terms, probably somewhat disparagingly, these super apostles. These sort of superheroes that are coming through here. So, and apparently, when he had come to visit them, someone had offended him so badly about this that his personal relationship to the church was even on the line. So even his caring about them, he was ready to throw in the towel. They were ready for a breakup. It got to that point. So he writes to them. Because of this, he takes a mini visit. I've skipped over this in my notes, excuse me. Takes a mini visit from Ephesus back to Corinth real quick for a few months to just check in with everybody. And that actually makes things worse, not better. And he comes back from that and then writes the letter. And it's at that moment where he says, I had an interaction with someone who made me feel so bad about myself and my approach to the gospel that I'm almost ready to throw in the towel on you guys. So he comes back from that visit and he writes to them in Ephesus. And he is mad. He uses all his rhetorical tools of invective and irony and scorn and open threats and satire. He makes fun of them. He yells at them. He's at the end of his wits. And so he's throwing everything he's got at them. And he says, look at what is before your eyes. If you are confident that you belong to Christ, remind yourself of this, that just as you belong to Christ, so also do we. Now, even if I boast a little too much, because he has to argue for himself, right? And so he's doing something he hates, which is boasting about why they should listen to him. But he can't not do that because the other people are doing it. And so it's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy here. But if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave me for building you up and not tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem as though I am trying to frighten you with my letters. For they say, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is contemptible. So he doesn't cut a good figure in the flesh, but his letters are very rough. Let such people understand that what we say by letter when we are absent, we will also do when present, which is a little bit of a threat, right? Or not a little bit, it's a threat. So he finds himself in this impossible position where a man who is trying to champion this gospel of humility, of sacrifice, has to kind of argue for himself in the positive, but the positive is, I'm so weak and so poorly spoken and so unimpressive that the gospel must be true. Do you see the trickiness of this whole thing, right? So he doesn't want to do that because he thinks it's antithetical to his call as a servant of Christ, but he's stuck in this position of having to, and also to challenge with some aggression, his colleagues. So he's all over the place in 2 Corinthians, if you read through there. And that's the one where he writes at the end, he goes, look at what big letters I'm writing with my hand. He's literally trying to yell at them through this letter. And that's all he can do. So it's kind of cool to think about, the size of his handwriting impacted by the emotions he was feeling to portray the way we would sort of highlight or bold or star something in a letter. Say, this is particularly, I want you to listen to this, and whoever's reading it needs to yell it. Okay? That's what he's trying to get at. But he's literally writing bigger letters. He writes at the end of that whole thing. So, you want to know what happened? All right. There's a portion of a third letter that's spliced in chapters 1 and 2, and then there's another section in chapter 7 that it seems like he was able to salvage the relationship. Titus, he had sent Titus from Ephesus with one of the earlier letters that is stitched in here, and it seems that Titus was able to smooth things over, not Paul. So Titus does the work of reconciliation amongst the Corinthian church. He writes in 2 Corinthians, Paul writes, but God, who consoles the downcast, consoled us by the arrival of Titus, and not only by his coming, but also by the consolation with which he was consoled about you, as he told us of your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced still more. For even if I made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it. Though I did regret it, for I see that I grieved you with that letter, though only briefly. You see, he's really still all over the place here. It's like, I don't regret yelling at you. I kind of regret yelling at you. Now I rejoice not because you were grieved, but because your grief has led to repentance, for you felt a godly grief, so that you were not harmed in any way by us. So this is him saying, like, it sounds like you guys have come, that Titus is telling me, you guys have sort of gotten your heads back on straight. And now we can move forward here. And it did salvage the relationship, but and then he goes on to say, and I want to come see you now that things are better. It'll be much nicer when we visit. But he's not ultimately able to get there because, for reasons that are unclear, he gets thrown into prison in Ephesus. So he's not free anymore to move around the ancient world. And he's imprisoned. He starts that imprisonment in the winter of 54 to 55, the turnover of the year, from 54 to 55. It's not his first imprisonment, that's clear. He makes reference to others. But it is here in prison, while still in Ephesus, that he writes the letter to the Philippians and the letter to Philemon. Those are the last two before the letter to the Romans, which is a little bit of a different kettle of fish. Paul had received a gift of money from Philippi that was brought by Epaphroditus, who gets sick when he's there. So Paul sends Timothy from Ephesus to Philippi with this letter. And in this letter, this is the letter to the Philippians now, the main issue has a lot more to do with the fate of the apostle, the fate of Paul, than it does with particular divisions or issues within that community. Because the question is, now that he is in prison and has been for some time, what's going to happen to these churches? If they lose their son, will they continue to orbit and continue to hold together? That's the main question with the Philippians. So again, Philippians seems to be about 3 authentic Pauline fragments joined together, and the main one there is written from prison. That's basically 1, 2, and beginnings of 3, because he reflects on his imprisonment. He talks about how he is suffering significantly and how he is restrained and in chains. But the content of the letter, if you read Philippians, does anybody know the main word that shows up in Philippians over and over and over again, 16 times in 4 chapters? Joy. The main word is joy, which is ironic, isn't it? Given that he's at perhaps his lowest point as a disciple, as an apostle. He focuses on fellowship, on bonds of love, and on joy. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. That's Philippians, right? He's considering, it's the other same line where he says, do not worry about anything, but consider others as better than yourselves. And he assures them that Christ will be glorified through his death or through his life. We'll hear today, in today's passage, he's saying, I don't want to know anything but Jesus. And that's what matters. It doesn't matter if I'm there with you or I'm not there with you. What matters is our straining forward, our reaching forward towards that heavenly prize. Remember, we're into Philippians now on Sundays, right? Remember last week, we didn't preach on it, but there was the Christ hymn, right? For Christ, who, for though in the form of God, did not regard equality of God as something to be exploited, but in humility regarded others as better than himself. That is the mind of Christ. He said, let that mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. He's trying to set them up to exist without him. That's the mode of Philippians here. And so what's interesting is he focuses on these bonds of love, this sense of humility, and this sense of joy. Right? So have joy together. You don't need me to love each other. You don't need me to serve each other. You do not need me to rejoice together. Those are the main contents there. And so the apostle, he says, is nothing more than a sacrifice poured out for the church. And its continuation is what's important. He writes, therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. It's God, not me. But even if I am being poured out as a libation over the or of the sacrifice, an offering of your faith, I am glad and will rejoice with all of you, and in the same way you also must be glad and rejoice with me. Do you see? That's just a little passage there, but do you see what he's trying to do there? He's trying to take himself out of the middle of this so that they can continue to exist as a church without him. Give yourself fully for the benefit of the whole. He's back to that idea. That conforms you to Christ. That giving of oneself for the benefit of others or for the whole, which is, in a nutshell, what Jesus did. Right? Unanimity, mutual respect, renunciation of one's own importance, that's all part of this. Now there's another section that of the letter that is a smaller portion, which does seem to have some more opponents that are in there saying, you should just go by the law. And he says, no, you can be perfect. You can't be perfect through the law in this life. He says, no one is. It must be chased after. It must be stretched after. That's today's passage on Sunday. Forward into the future. And it's not going to be achieved by your own effort. It's only ever achieved, any progress there, only ever achieved by the grace of God and the goodness of Jesus Christ. So he's trying to balance these end goals of what we're striving for, while also giving them instructions on how to behave and be together in the interim on how to get there. So like all his letters, part of this is what do we believe, and then how do we behave in order to get that way. Okay? So that's the letter to Philippians: joy, fellowship, love, humility, sacrifice, from a man who's in prison, writing without an understanding of whether he's going to be able to ever go see these people again at that point. It's very clear he doesn't think he will. All right, last letter, and then I'm going to stop for questions. I'm just going to move quickly through Philemon, because it's a fascinating little letter. It's worth spending a few minutes on. We don't hear it often. It's just a chapter long, but it's worth reading because it's the only letter that Paul wrote, the authentic Pauline letter, written to an individual rather than a group. It's written to a friend of his, and it's more casual and more personal. So his friend Philemon lives in Colossae. You can look at your map if you need to see that. It's another one of the cities where he had traveled through and founded a church. And it seems like Philemon is probably one of the founders of that Colossian church. Now, Philemon has a slave named Onesimus who runs away, maybe because he stole something or didn't behave right. And he comes from Colossae to Ephesus, where Paul is in prison, and kind of helps him out. He's helpful to him, he's good to him, and they become very close. But Paul knows that he can't keep him, so he sends him back to Philemon, his owner, with this letter. And it's interesting because this is one of the few early Christian documents we have that deals directly with the issue of slavery in the ancient world, which is not directly identical to chattel slavery in America, but is similar in the sense that these are people who had no freedom and had to do what you told them, and they didn't get paid. Now, there are other things that are different, but it's not a good position to be in, generally. And it's a question whether Paul actually demands that Philemon free Onesimus. And he never says that explicitly, but he uses all these shaded angles to try to get to him like this. For this reason, he writes, though I am bold enough in Christ to command you to do your duty, yet I would rather appeal to you on the basis of love. And I, Paul, do this as an old man. Now he makes him, an old man. And now also as a prisoner of Christ Jesus. He's trying to make him feel bad, right? I am appealing to you for my child Onesimus, whose father I have become during my imprisonment. We've grown close. If he has wronged you in any way, or owes you anything, charge that to my account. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will repay it. So you don't have the excuse that you could treat him badly because he owes you anything, because I'm going to repay it. I say nothing about your owing me, even yourself. So I'm not going to bring up the fact that I was the one who brought you to Christ. Yes, brother, let me have this benefit from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Christ. Confident in your obedience, he says, I am writing to you, knowing that you will do even more than what I say. One thing more. Prepare a guest room for me, for I am hoping through your prayers to be restored to you. So he says, it's all this sort of passive, shaded language around saying, you got to accept him as a brother the way you would accept me, which, without saying it, without commanding it, is saying free him. And then he also says, oh, and just by the way, I'm going to come visit. So I'm going to know how this went. Now, it's unclear whether he did or not actually come visit. It's unclear what actually happened to Onesimus when he returned. But we have this letter, and it's a fascinating introduction into the mindset of someone like Paul about what the Christian faith or an understanding of Jesus does to how this relationship-based reason to release your slaves. Okay? Based on these bonds of love, treating each other with mutuality and equality and respect. Right? Accept him as a brother. Not a conditional acceptance. I'm willing to cover the cost. And for Paul, freedom, the commandment of love that comes with this freedom, means that freedom needs to be granted to anyone and everyone without a personal obligation. All right? Now, I'm going to pause there for questions. We've got Romans left, and then we're going to talk about the end of Paul's life, and then sort of post-Paul, what happens with him and some of the Deutero-Pauline letters. That'll be next week, okay? But you with me here? We've sort of covered most of the letters that have come through this, that we know as authentic Pauline letters based upon places he's writing to. But questions? Carrie?
First of all, was there a female equivalent to circumcision? I know it's not female circumcision, but like men, you said that's a point for men, anything for women?
Not that I'm aware of. The question is, was there a female equivalent for circumcision as far as abiding by the law or showing you're abiding by the law? Not that I'm aware of. Not that would have been so physically demanding. No.
Also, what was prison like when Paul was there?
It's a good question. It probably was. What was prison like when Paul was in there? Probably not pleasant, but probably not quite as restrictive as we might imagine it to be. I think people could come and go. I don't think he doesn't say that he was beaten or tortured or anything like that. I think they would basically be providing for his needs, but without allowing him to move around freely. That is what I'm gleaning, not having done it, couldn't say for sure. And others who know about the Roman Empire could probably give you a better answer than I do. Yeah.
And finally, you said the second Corinthians was letter fragments. Who joined all those letter fragments?
We'll talk about that next week, how these things start to get collected and then put together, and why why there's a portion in Romans, the last chapter of Romans, chapter 16, that gets affixed to it, is very clearly a letter that was meant to accompany that letter when it was sent to Ephesus to be sent on to the Romans. So it's like addressed to all these people in Ephesus, and so it doesn't read like a letter to someone who's in Rome. So we can talk a little. Well, it gives us a little bit of an idea of why they were together, and someone just said, "Well, these must go together," but they didn't. Yeah, Andrew.
In the Roman Empire, as he wished, but it doesn't seem, but as you said, it doesn't seem he was particularly cruel. And also, he wouldn't have been allowed to send out letters without permission of the said jailer.
Okay, that's really helpful, Andrew. That's really good. So Andrew's telling us that jailers would have been private contractors, so it was up to them to determine how they were treating their prisoners, which is a fascinating idea. And it does seem like he was given a certain amount of freedom because he was able to send some letters and was also doesn't seem to have been suffered too greatly. That's really helpful, Andrew. Thank you. Other questions? Dan? Yeah?
Was there any thing in Judaism at that time to where they were going out and getting new Jews?
Yeah.
Or was it only through birth and or marriage?
That's a good question. Yes, there was a sort of evangelistic component to Judaism. You could say it still happens, less frequently. But yes, in those days, it was not unheard of for people to say, to be promoting the Jewish faith and the one true God, but you need to abide by these certain practices and rules. Yes, so that did exist. Good question.
If you've ever known an adult who was circumcised, you'll know what the problem was.
Yes, I would. Other questions? Fine. Yeah, Jennifer.
So the Episcopal Church, and notwithstanding how we do communion here,
Yeah.
but I've always found a disconnect between the way it was presented in the Gospels with Jesus at the Last Supper, and then the references here for Paul seem to be a little different about
Yeah.
the church. Does the Episcopal Church, as it draws upon the tradition of communion today, in your opinion, reference more this Pauline idea of that you need to consider the body as opposed to, in my opinion, when Jesus has his Last Supper, it's sort of all are welcome at the table, whereas the Episcopal Church, not how we do it here, but it wants people to already have been baptized.
Yeah. So the question has to do with our treatment, the Episcopal Church's treatment of the Eucharist, based upon both the Pauline representations of it and the gospel representations of it. I would say we try to do both. I would say we try to commemorate this particular moment in time, this Last Supper, when Jesus performs this ritual act, which is why the Paula people were doing it. They didn't invent it. They were doing it because Jesus had said, "Do this in remembrance of me." But it takes on a slightly different character and form. It's still eschatological in its intent, which means it's still looking towards that coming of Christ. But until then, we're going to do these things over and over again so that we continue to sort of be nourished spiritually and physically to continue on this journey. So I think that is, with the end of Jesus' life upcoming, it turns into more of a focus on Jesus' second coming, as far as the current way the church has adopted it based on the Paul thing. Now, it's more communal, it's more meant to help form the practices of a particular people in a time and place, but then that gets picked up and carried forward, which is part of the cool power of it, to say we are performing a ritual act that has also been performed by people in this time and place for throughout history. So that may be a little different than what you're saying, this sort of all are welcome, just come, Judas, even you can have supper idea of the Last Supper. But I do think they're related, and I do think the Episcopal Church is trying to incorporate both of those understandings of what's going on. Is that helpful?
It is. I guess my question is, I've just noticed some Episcopal Church, there's a division there. Some Episcopal churches, if you're not baptized
Yep.
in the church, you're not welcome at the table.
That is true. And that remains, people should know, the canonical law. And that has been voted on a number of times. Now, there are some dispensations given, but that is still that's the party line for right now. And part of that has to do, I think, with more of that Pauline idea, which is this is something that is central to the forming and the sustaining and maintenance of a community. And by being baptized, you're saying, I am and am choosing to be a part of this community. Yeah. Carrie, last question, and then we got to go to church.
What would the Episcopal Church say about being unworthy? Kind of follows up to Jennifer's question. If you're unworthy and you take communion, you're gonna be screwed, basically.
I don't think they'd have. So the question is, can one be unworthy to receive communion? Yes, there are rubrics for that, and you are supposed to examine yourself. That's why we do the confession and the absolution and the peace before communion, because that is a form of reconciliation with oneself and one's neighbor. And I'm going to punt a little bit because in Lent, we're planning an entire series, 5 weeks, on the Eucharist. And so Jared, Katie Beth, and I will be leading us through different aspects of it, and then I think we'll be able to talk more about some of the understandings of the practices and the beliefs that surround it. Is that fair? All right. Well, thank you guys.